The German Shepherd hadn't moved in 72 hours. Nurses at St. Mary's Hospital whispered about the dog stationed outside the ICU window, his massive frame rigid as a sentinel. Security had tried removing him twice. Each time, Duke returned before they reached the parking lot. "That's the third day," murmured Nurse Patricia, adjusting her reading glasses. "Poor thing won't even take water." Dr. Martinez paused his rounds, studying the motionless figure through the glass. The dog's amber eyes never wavered from the empty hospital bed inside, bed 314, where Betty Mae Thompson had spent her final moments 3 days ago. "Someone needs to call animal control," Patricia whispered. But Duke wasn't just grieving. His powerful chest rose and fell with purpose, ears alert despite his exhaustion. He was waiting, keeping a promise that would shatter hearts and heal souls in ways no one could imagine. What they didn't know was that Duke was keeping a promise that would break your heart. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Betty Mae Thompson had been the picture of Southern resilience. At 72, the retired Army nurse still maintained her morning walks through Millfield's tree-lined streets, Duke trotting faithfully beside her. Her silver hair was always perfectly styled for Sunday service at First Baptist, and her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades caring for others. Betty Mae had earned that authority the hard way. Widowed at 28 when her husband James didn't come home from Vietnam, she'd raised their son Michael alone while working double shifts at the county hospital. The framed Purple Heart on her mantelpiece belonged to James. The folded flag beneath it belonged to Michael, lost to an IED in Afghanistan 15 years later. "The Lord doesn't give us more than we can handle," she'd tell anyone who'd listen, though her weathered hands sometimes trembled when she touched those frames. Duke had entered her life 2 years ago through the local animal rescue. The 4-year-old German Shepherd was a washout from police training, too gentle, they said, though his intelligence was undeniable. Betty Mae saw something else, a dog who understood loss. When she adopted him, Duke seemed to recognize a kindred spirit. They became inseparable. Her adopted daughter, Rebecca Collins, worried constantly. At 38, Dr. Becca had built a successful veterinary practice in Nashville, an hour's drive from Millfield. She visited every weekend, bringing medical supplies and concern in equal measure. "Mama, you need to slow down," Becca would insist, using the title that had come naturally since Betty Mae pulled her from a burning house 20 years ago. The 8-year-old orphan had become family instantly, loved as fiercely as any biological child. But Becca had a secret shame: severe allergies to dogs. She could treat them professionally with medication, but living with one was impossible. The irony wasn't lost on her, a veterinarian who couldn't share her adoptive mother's greatest companion. Down the street lived Tommy Ray Jenkins, 45 and hollowed by demons, Betty Mae recognized. The Vietnam veteran drank too much and spoke too little, his yard overgrown with neglect. Neighbors whispered about his monthly disability checks and the empty bottles accumulating on his porch. Betty Mae never whispered. She'd nod politely when their paths crossed, sometimes leaving casseroles on his doorstep with notes signed "A Friend." Tommy Ray never acknowledged the gifts, but the empty dishes always reappeared, washed clean. Duke seemed fascinated by Tommy Ray, often pausing during walks to study the man's hunched figure. Betty Mae would tug the leash gently. "Come along, boy." Some folks need more time to heal. She couldn't know that time was running short, or that Duke's interest in Tommy Ray wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. The dog sensed something Betty Mae's trained eye had missed. Tommy Ray wasn't just broken. He was drowning, and Duke had been trained for exactly this kind of rescue. The Sunday morning started like any other. Betty Mae had pressed her navy dress, pinned her silver hair into its customary bun, and clipped Duke's leash to his collar for their walk to First Baptist Church. The October air carried the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter, though Tennessee's autumn still held warmth in its embrace. Duke seemed restless during the service, shifting position every few minutes beside Betty May's usual pew. Pastor Williams was midway through his sermon on Job's perseverance when Betty May felt the first sharp pain slice through her chest. She gripped the wooden pew, knuckles white, breathing shallow. Duke's head snapped up instantly. His amber eyes locked onto her face, reading distress signals invisible to human eyes. A low whine escaped his throat, barely audible but urgent. "Shh, boy," Betty May whispered, her southern politeness stronger than her pain. "We're in the Lord's house." But Duke wouldn't be silenced. He stood, placing his massive head against her arm, pressing with gentle insistence. The congregation was beginning to notice. Mrs. Henderson, seated behind them, leaned forward with concern. "Betty May, honey, you all right?" The second wave of pain hit like a freight train. Betty May doubled over, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Duke immediately moved to support her, his body becoming a living brace against her collapse. "Call 911!" Pastor Williams shouted from the pulpit, abandoning his sermon as chaos erupted in the sanctuary. The ambulance ride blurred past in fragments. Duke rode alongside, the paramedics making an exception they'd never made before. Something about the dog's behavior convinced them he wasn't just a pet. He was providing medical assistance they couldn't replicate. "Ma'am, can you tell me your pain level?" the paramedic asked. Betty May's eyes found Duke's steady gaze. "It's manageable," she lied, her voice barely a whisper. At St. Mary's Hospital, Dr. Rodriguez met them in the emergency bay. The chest x-rays told a story Betty May had suspected but refused to acknowledge. The persistent cough she'd blamed on allergies, the fatigue she'd attributed to age, the weight loss she'd welcomed, they all pointed to one devastating conclusion. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to discuss your test results," Dr. Rodriguez said gently, his accent softening the harsh reality he was about to deliver. Betty May sat on the examination table, Duke pressed against her legs despite hospital regulations. No one had the heart to remove him. "How long?" she asked simply, cutting through medical euphemisms with the directness of someone who'd spent decades in hospitals. "Stage 4 lung cancer. The tumors are extensive without treatment, perhaps 2 to 3 months, with aggressive chemotherapy, possibly 6. The room fell silent, except for the steady rhythm of Duke's breathing. Betty May's hand found his head, fingers threading through his thick fur. "And with treatment, what kind of life would I have?" "Difficult," Dr. Rodriguez admitted. "Nausea, fatigue, hair loss. The treatment might extend your time, but it would be challenging." Betty May closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 72 years settling on her shoulders. When she opened them, she found Duke watching her with an intelligence that never ceased to amaze her. "Doctor, I need to make some phone calls, and I need to speak with my boy here." Dr. Rodriguez looked confused. "Your son?" "My Duke," she clarified, scratching behind the German shepherd's ears. "He's all the family I've got nearby." The doctor left them alone. Betty May slid down from the examination table and knelt beside Duke, ignoring the protest from her arthritic knees. She took his massive head in both hands, looking directly into his eyes. "Listen to me, boy. Mama's got to go away for a while. But I need you to promise me something." Her voice cracked, but she continued. "You wait for me, no matter what. And when the time comes, you help whoever needs you most. Can you do that for me?" Duke's tail gave a single, deliberate wag. He pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture that spoke of understanding beyond words. When Becca arrived an hour later, She found them still in that position. Her adoptive mother's tears had dried, but Duke's fur was damp where her face had pressed against his neck. "Mama?" Becca's voice was small, vulnerable in a way that reminded Betty May of the frightened 8-year-old she'd once rescued. "Come here, baby girl." The conversation that followed was the hardest of both their lives. Becca begged Betty May to move to Nashville, to let her provide care, but practical reality intruded. Becca's allergies made it impossible for Duke to live there, and Betty May wouldn't abandon her companion. "What about Duke?" Becca asked, voicing the question that had been haunting Betty May since the diagnosis. "I've been thinking about that." Betty May's eyes drifted toward the window, where evening shadows were lengthening. "Tommy Ray Jenkins has been looking mighty lonely lately." "That drunk?" Becca's voice carried disbelief. "Mama, you can't be serious. He can barely take care of himself." "Sometimes the people who seem most broken are just waiting for a reason to heal," Betty May replied quietly. "Duke's got a gift for seeing what others can't." As if summoned by his name, Duke moved to the window. His posture changed, alert and focused. Betty May followed his gaze and saw a familiar figure in the parking lot below. Tommy Ray Jenkins, standing beside an old pickup truck, staring up at the hospital windows. How did he know to come? Becca wondered aloud. Betty May smiled, her hand finding Duke's neck. Word travels fast in a small town. Or maybe, she paused, watching Tommy Ray's upward gaze, maybe some folks just recognize when they're needed. The decision to start chemotherapy wasn't made lightly. Betty May knew the statistics, understood the side effects, and harbored no illusions about miraculous recoveries. But she also knew Duke needed time to prepare for whatever came next. 6 months might be enough to teach him, and whoever would inherit his care, how to navigate the darkness ahead. That night, back in her own bed with Duke curled on the floor beside her, Betty May made a promise of her own. She would use whatever time remained to ensure Duke's future was secure. The dog had saved her from loneliness after Michael's death. Now she would save him from abandonment after hers. Outside, Tommy Ray's truck remained parked across the street, its occupant keeping a vigil he couldn't explain but couldn't abandon. 4 months into Betty May's treatment, Duke had transformed from a companion into a guardian angel with fur. The chemotherapy sessions at the Regional Cancer Center had taken their toll. Betty May's silver hair had thinned to wisps, her appetite had dwindled, and her once steady hands now trembled with fatigue. But Duke seemed to anticipate her needs before she recognized them herself. He learned to fetch her medications at precise times, carrying the pill bottles gently in his mouth. When nausea overwhelmed her, he'd position himself as a living pillow, his warm body providing comfort no heating pad could match. Most remarkably, he seemed to sense her pain levels, becoming more attentive on difficult days and allowing her space when she felt stronger. Becca visited every weekend, driving down from Nashville with groceries and medical supplies. The guilt in her eyes grew more pronounced with each visit, especially when she watched Duke's devoted care. "I should be doing this," she whispered to Betty May one Saturday afternoon, watching Duke bring a glass of water without being asked. "You are doing it, baby girl. Just differently." Betty May's voice was weaker now, but her tone remained firm. "Love isn't about proximity. It's about knowing what's best, even when it hurts." It was during one of these weekend visits that the first revelation emerged. Becca was sorting through old photo albums, digitizing memories at Betty May's request, when she paused at a newspaper clipping tucked between pages. "Mama, what's this?" She held up a yellowed article from the Millfield Gazette, dated 20 years earlier. "Local nurse saves child from house fire." Betty May glanced over, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Oh, that old thing. But Becca was reading intently now. The article described how Army nurse Betty Mae Thompson had pulled an 8-year-old girl from a burning house on Maple Street, performing CPR until paramedics arrived. The child's parents had died in the blaze. The girl's name was Rebecca Martinez. "Martinez," Becca whispered, her hands trembling. My last name before you adopted me was Martinez." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Duke, sensing tension, moved to sit between the two women, his presence a buffer against the emotional storm brewing. "You never told me you were the one who saved me," Becca's voice cracked. "All these years, I thought you just adopted me from the system." Betty Mae removed her glasses, suddenly looking every one of her 72 years. "I didn't save you, honey. You saved me. After Michael died, I thought my purpose was finished. Then God put you in my path." "But why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you feeling obligated. I wanted you to love me because you chose to, not because you owed me a debt." The weight of this revelation settled over Becca like a heavy blanket. Everything she'd questioned about her place in the family, every moment of feeling like an outsider, suddenly shifted into focus. She wasn't just adopted, she was rescued, chosen, claimed by a woman who saw beyond the tragedy to the potential beneath. Duke moved to Becca's side, resting his head on her knee. The gesture was deliberate, comforting, as if he understood the magnitude of what she was processing. "He knows," Betty Mae observed softly. "Duke's always been good at reading hearts." As autumn deepened into early winter, Duke's behavior began shifting in ways that puzzled Becca, but made perfect sense to Betty Mae. During their daily walks, he'd pause longer at Tommy Ray's house, sometimes sitting at the edge of the property as if waiting for something. Tommy Ray had been more visible lately, raking leaves in his yard and replacing broken porch boards. The empty bottles had disappeared from his porch, though whether this represented sobriety or better camouflage remained unclear. He'd nod respectfully when he saw Betty Mae and Duke, sometimes raising a hand in greeting, but never approaching. One crisp November morning, as Betty Mae struggled with a particularly difficult day following chemotherapy, she noticed Tommy Ray working in his garden. Something about his posture, straight-backed despite his troubles, triggered a memory. "Duke, sit," she commanded, studying Tommy Ray's movements. The way he knelt by the flower bed, the precision of his hand movements, the almost military bearing even in civilian clothes. "Well, I'll be damned," she whispered. That afternoon she asked Becca to bring a specific box from the attic, Michael's military photographs and correspondence. Among the pictures of desert landscapes and uniformed soldiers, she found what she was looking for: a group photo of Michael's unit in Afghanistan. There, standing beside her son in desert camouflage, was a younger version of Tommy Ray Jenkins. "Sweet Jesus," Betty Mae breathed, her finger tracing Tommy Ray's face in the photograph. On the back, Michael's handwriting identified the soldiers. "Me and Tommy Ray, after the Kandahar patrol. He saved my ass today, literally." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Tommy Ray wasn't just a troubled neighbor. He was a connection to Michael, a living piece of her son's story she'd never known existed. No wonder Duke was drawn to him. The dog's intuition had recognized what her human eyes had missed. That evening, against Becca's protests, Betty Mae insisted on walking to Tommy Ray's house. Duke led the way, his tail wagging with unusual enthusiasm as they approached the small, weathered home. Tommy Ray was sitting on his porch steps, whittling a piece of wood with methodical precision. He looked up as they approached, his eyes widening with recognition, not of Betty Mae, but of something else entirely. "Ma'am," he said quietly, rising to his feet with military courtesy. "Tommy Ray Jenkins," Betty Mae said, her voice carrying the authority of her nursing days. I think it's time we talked." He nodded slowly, his weathered face a map of old pain and recent struggle. "Yes, ma'am, I expect it is." They sat on his porch while Duke positioned himself between them, a furry mediator for a conversation 20 years overdue. The evening air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, nature's own preparation for the difficult season ahead. "You knew my son," Betty May began, not making it a question. Tommy Ray's hands stilled on the piece of wood. "Yes, ma'am. Michael Thompson. Good soldier." "Better man." His voice carried the weight of old grief, carefully controlled but never fully buried. "Tell me about him. Tell me about Afghanistan." What followed was a conversation that lasted until well past dark, filled with stories Betty May had never heard and pain Tommy Ray had never shared. Duke listened to every word, his intelligent eyes moving between the speakers as if he understood the importance of this moment. Michael had indeed saved Tommy Ray's life during a patrol in Kandahar, but the full story was more complex than any military report could capture. They'd been together when the IED exploded 3 years later, the one that killed Michael and left Tommy Ray with traumatic brain injury and survivor's guilt that had destroyed his marriage, his career, and nearly his life. "I tried to reach out after," Tommy Ray admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wanted to tell you what he meant to us. But what do you say to a mother who lost everything? How do you explain that her boy died saving a worthless piece of trash like me?" Betty May's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "You tell her that her son lived according to his values, that his sacrifice meant something, that she raised him right." Duke moved closer to Tommy Ray, pressing against his leg in a gesture of comfort that was clearly learned, not instinctual. Tommy Ray's hand found the dog's head automatically, as if he'd been doing it all his life. "Michael used to talk about getting a dog when he came home," Tommy Ray said softly. "Said he wanted a German shepherd. Smart and loyal, he said. Something to help with the transition back to civilian life." Betty May felt the pieces clicking into place like a puzzle solving itself. "Duke isn't just a pet, is he?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Tommy Ray's smile was sad but genuine. "No, ma'am. If I'm not mistaken, he's exactly what Michael ordered." The revelation about Tommy Ray's connection to Michael changed the entire dynamic of Betty May's final months. What had begun as a terminal diagnosis became something closer to a mission, a chance to honor her son's memory by completing what he'd started. Duke seemed to understand the shift instinctively. His daily routine expanded to include Tommy Ray's house, where he'd spend mornings helping Betty May with her recovery exercises, and afternoons sitting with the veteran on his porch. The arrangement happened gradually, naturally, as if orchestrated by forces beyond their control. Tommy Ray's transformation was remarkable to witness. The haunted, disheveled man who'd hidden behind empty bottles began emerging as someone Betty May recognized from Michael's stories, the soldier who'd earned her son's respect and friendship. Duke's presence seemed to unlock something in Tommy Ray that years of VA counseling hadn't touched. "He's got the same energy as the dogs we worked with overseas," Tommy Ray explained one afternoon, watching Duke demonstrate an uncanny ability to sense when his PTSD symptoms were escalating. "Military working dogs," they called them. "But Duke's different. He's not just trained, he's intuitive." Betty May nodded, though she was learning to conserve her energy for conversations that mattered. The chemotherapy was losing its effectiveness, and Dr. Rodriguez had gently suggested they discuss comfort care options. She hadn't shared this development with Becca yet, knowing her daughter would insist on more aggressive treatments that would only prolong suffering without extending meaningful life. The bond between Duke and Tommy Ray deepened with each passing day. The dog had developed a routine of arriving at Tommy Ray's house precisely when the veteran's afternoon anxiety typically peaked, around 3 p.m., the same time Michael had died in Afghanistan. Duke would position himself at Tommy Ray's feet, his warm weight serving as an anchor to the present moment. "It's like he knows," Tommy Ray marveled, his fingers working through Duke's thick coat. "Yesterday, I was having flashbacks about the explosion, and he brought me his tennis ball, forced me to play fetch until the episode passed." Betty May smiled from her chair on Tommy Ray's porch, where she'd taken to spending her stronger afternoons. "Duke's always been good at reading people, but with you it's different. It's like he's remembering something." The community had begun to notice the unlikely friendship developing between the dying nurse, the troubled veteran, and the remarkable dog. Neighbors who'd previously whispered about Tommy Ray's drinking now spoke admiringly about his transformation. Mrs. Henderson from the church stopped by regularly with casseroles, marveling at how that sweet dog worked miracles. Becca remained skeptical during her weekend visits. She could see the positive changes in Tommy Ray, but her medical training made her worry about the long-term stability of his improvement. "What happens when you're gone, Mama?" she asked during a private moment while Tommy Ray was inside making coffee. "What if he relapses? What if Duke gets hurt?" Betty May had been expecting this conversation. "Sometimes you have to have faith in people's capacity to rise to the occasion," she said quietly. "Tommy Ray isn't broken, he's wounded. There's a difference. But Duke is your responsibility. You can't just hand him over to someone who—" "Someone who what?" Betty May's voice carried a sharpness that surprised them both. "Someone who's poor, someone who's struggled with addiction, someone who doesn't have a veterinary degree?" Becca flinched. "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" Betty May softened her tone. "Baby girl, you've given me everything a mother could want. But love isn't about having the perfect circumstances. It's about having the perfect heart." The conversation was interrupted by Duke's sudden alertness. His head snapped toward the street, ears pricked forward. Moments later, a car pulled into Tommy Ray's driveway, a sedan with government plates and two men in suits. Tommy Ray emerged from the house, his posture immediately shifting to military attention as he recognized official visitors. Betty May watched the interaction from across the yard, noting how Duke positioned himself protectively beside Tommy Ray. The conversation was brief, but intense. The men handed Tommy Ray several documents, spoke in low, serious tones, and departed within 10 minutes. Tommy Ray stood in his driveway long after they'd gone, staring at the papers in his hands. Duke approached him slowly, pressing against his legs in comfort. Tommy Ray's hand found the dog's head automatically, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Everything all right?" Betty May called. Tommy Ray walked toward them, his expression unreadable. "VA's been reviewing my disability case. Seems my improvements have been noticed." Becca straightened in her chair. "What does that mean?" "They want to reassess my mental health rating. If they determine I'm significantly improved, they might reduce my benefits." Tommy Ray's voice was carefully controlled, but Betty May could hear the underlying panic. The implications hit immediately. Tommy Ray's disability payments were his only source of income. Without them, he couldn't afford his house, his medication, or basic necessities. The improvements that everyone celebrated might ultimately cost him everything. "Those government bastards," Betty May muttered, her nursing vocabulary asserting itself. "They penalize people for getting better." Duke seemed to sense the tension, moving between the three humans as if trying to hold them together through proximity. His behavior triggered a memory in Betty May, something Michael had written in one of his letters about military dogs being retrained for civilian life. "Tommy Ray," she said slowly, "what do you know about therapy dog certification?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, But Tommy Ray's military mind immediately grasped the strategic implications. "You thinking Duke could be officially recognized?" "I'm thinking Duke's already doing the work. Maybe it's time he got paid for it." The idea took shape over the following days. Research revealed that certified therapy dogs and their handlers could work in various settings: hospitals, nursing homes, schools, veteran centers. The income wouldn't replace full disability benefits, but it might bridge the gap if Tommy Ray's rating was reduced. More importantly, it would give Tommy Ray a purpose beyond surviving his own demons. Duke's natural abilities became more apparent as they investigated the requirements. He already demonstrated the temperament, training, and intuitive responses that therapy organizations sought. The formal certification would simply acknowledge what everyone already knew. Duke was a healer. Becca found herself reluctantly impressed by the plan's practicality. "You're essentially creating a business partnership," she observed. "Duke provides the therapy, Tommy Ray provides the handler skills, and Michael provides the inspiration," Betty May added softly. The certification process required medical documentation of Duke's abilities, training verification, and behavioral assessments. Betty May threw herself into the project with renewed energy, treating it like a final mission. She contacted her former colleagues at the hospital, reached out to the VA center where Tommy Ray received treatment, and even convinced Pastor Williams to write a letter of recommendation. Duke seemed to understand the importance of the evaluations. During the formal assessment with a certified therapy dog instructor, he performed flawlessly, demonstrating calm behavior around medical equipment, appropriate responses to stress signals, and the ability to follow complex commands while maintaining his focus on human emotional needs. "This is remarkable," the instructor commented, watching Duke guide Tommy Ray through a simulated anxiety attack. "Most dogs require months of specialized training to reach this level. Duke appears to be working on pure instinct." "He's had a good teacher," Tommy Ray replied, his eyes finding Betty May across the room. As December arrived, bringing cold winds and shorter days, Betty May felt time compressing around her. The certification paperwork was progressing, but her energy was failing faster than anticipated. Some days, she couldn't make the walk to Tommy Ray's house. Duke would go alone, returning hours later with reports written in his behavior. Tail wagging meant Tommy Ray was having a good day. Subdued posture meant the veteran was struggling. The dynamic was shifting, and everyone could feel it. Duke was transitioning from being Betty May's companion to becoming Tommy Ray's partner. The process was gradual but unmistakable, like watching a river slowly change course. "He's choosing," Betty May told Becca during one of their evening conversations. "Duke's choosing his next mission." Becca nodded, though tears blurred her vision. "Are you okay with that?" Betty May's smile was peaceful despite her obvious pain. "Honey, the best thing about raising someone you love is watching them become who they're meant to be. That's true whether it's a child or a dog." Outside, Duke was visible through the window, sitting beside Tommy Ray's porch. Both figures were silhouetted against the setting sun, two veterans of different wars finding solace in each other's company. The transition was almost complete. December 15th marked the day everything changed. Betty May had been feeling stronger that morning, well enough to accompany Duke on his usual visit to Tommy Ray's house. The therapy dog certification had been approved, and Tommy Ray was scheduled to begin work at the VA center after the new year. For the first time in months, hope seemed to outweigh dread. The three of them were sitting on Tommy Ray's porch, watching Duke demonstrate his new skills with a training vest that identified him as a certified therapy animal. Betty May felt a surge of pride watching her boy work, every command executed perfectly, every response calibrated to human need. "Michael would be so proud," she murmured, her breath visible in the cold air. Tommy Ray nodded, adjusting Duke's vest with practiced hands. Your son always said the best soldiers are the ones who keep serving even after the war ends." It was then that Dr. Rodriguez's call came through on Betty May's cell phone. She answered with her characteristic directness, but Tommy Ray and Duke both sensed the shift in her posture as the conversation progressed. "I see," she said quietly. "How long do you estimate?" A pause. "No more treatments. We discussed this." Another pause. "Yes, I'll make the necessary arrangements." When she ended the call, the silence stretched between them like a physical presence. Duke moved immediately to her side, pressing his warm body against her legs. "The cancer's spread to my liver," Betty May announced with the clinical detachment of someone who'd delivered similar news to countless families. Days, not weeks. Tommy Ray's face went ashen. "Ma'am, surely there's something—" "There's nothing." Her voice was firm but not unkind. "And that's okay. I've had 72 good years and a chance to see Duke settled with the right person. That's more than many folks get." The weight of impending loss settled over them. But it was Duke's reaction that surprised everyone. Instead of becoming more clingy or anxious, he seemed to shift into a different mode entirely, alert, purposeful, almost professional. He moved between Betty May and Tommy Ray with deliberate intent, as if already beginning his transition from companion to caregiver. Becca arrived within 2 hours of Betty May's call, her face streaked with tears and her voice hoarse from crying during the drive from Nashville. She burst through the front door of her childhood home carrying medical supplies and desperate determination. "We're going to fight this," she announced, setting up what looked like a mobile medical unit in the living room. "There are experimental treatments, clinical trials, alternative therapies." "Rebecca." Betty May's voice stopped her daughter mid-sentence. "Sit down." The conversation that followed was brutal in its honesty. Betty May had already made her choice. No more hospitals, no more treatments that would steal her remaining time without extending her life meaningfully. She wanted to die at home, surrounded by love, with Duke by her side. "But I'm a doctor," Becca sobbed. "I'm supposed to save people." "You are saving me, baby girl. You're saving me from dying alone and afraid." Betty May's hand found her daughter's cheek. "That's the most important medicine there is." Duke seemed to understand that his role was expanding. Over the next 2 days, he rarely left Betty May's side, positioning himself where he could monitor her breathing and respond to her needs. When pain medication made her nauseous, he'd rest his head on her stomach, providing warmth and pressure that somehow helped. When she struggled to sleep, he'd settle beside her bed, his steady breathing serving as a living lullaby. Tommy Ray became a constant presence, handling practical matters with military efficiency. He coordinated meal deliveries from church members, managed visitors who wanted to pay their respects, and maintained the house with quiet competence. Duke seemed to approve of these arrangements, often positioning himself where he could observe both Betty May and Tommy Ray simultaneously. On December 17th, Betty May insisted on one final task. Despite her weakness, she called Tommy Ray and Becca to her bedside for what she termed the reading of the will. "Now, I know this might cause some disagreement," she began, her voice weaker but still carrying authority, "so I want to explain my reasoning while I still can." The will was straightforward in most respects. Becca inherited Betty May's savings and personal possessions, the church received a modest bequest, and various charities were remembered. But the house and property went to Tommy Ray Jenkins with the specific condition that he provide lifetime care for Duke. Becca's reaction was immediate and heated. "Mama, that house has been in our family for 40 years. You can't just give it away to someone who—" "Someone who what?" Betty May's interruption was sharp despite her physical weakness. "Someone who served with my son, someone who's proven he can care for Duke, someone who needs a purpose as much as Duke needs a home. But he's not family. Neither were you when I pulled you out of that burning house." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Family isn't about blood, Rebecca. It's about choice. It's about showing up. It's about love that doesn't require a legal document to prove itself. Tommy Ray tried to intervene. "Ma'am, I can't accept this. The house should go to Becca. I'll take care of Duke regardless." "You'll take the house because that's what Duke needs," Betty May said firmly. "A stable home, a yard to run in, and a person whose full-time job is his care. Becca's got her own life in Nashville, her own practice, her own future. You and Duke, you're going to build something new together." The argument continued for hours, with Duke moving restlessly between the three humans as tension filled the room. Finally, Betty May played her ace. "The house comes with a mortgage that's almost paid off and property taxes I've been struggling to cover on my fixed income," she revealed. "Tommy Ray, your disability benefits and Duke's therapy work will barely cover the expenses. This isn't a gift, it's a responsibility. And Becca, honey, you'll inherit enough to start that specialized animal clinic you've been dreaming about." The revelation reframed everything. Betty May wasn't choosing Tommy Ray over Becca. She was ensuring both had what they needed to fulfill their potential. Duke seemed to sense the resolution of conflict. He moved to Betty May's bedside and rested his massive head on her arm, his eyes reflecting understanding that transcended human language. That evening, as snow began falling outside her bedroom window, Betty May called Duke close for a private conversation. Tommy Ray and Becca were in the kitchen, working through the practical details of the transition, their voices carrying the awkward politeness of people learning to become family. "Listen to me, boy," Betty May whispered, her fingers working through Duke's fur. "Your real work is just beginning. Tommy Ray's going to need you more than he knows, and you're going to help him become the man Michael saw in him. Can you do that for me?" Duke's response was a single, deliberate tail wag, followed by a gentle lick to her hand, a kiss goodbye that felt like a promise. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering the world in pristine white. Inside, a woman prepared to complete her final mission, while a dog prepared to begin his greatest one. The transfer of love and responsibility was almost complete, marked not by legal documents, but by the quiet understanding that passed between a dying woman and the companion who would carry her legacy forward. Betty May Thompson passed away at 3:17 a.m. on December 19th, with Duke curled beside her bed and snow falling silently outside her window. Her death was peaceful, a gentle exhale that didn't return, her hand still resting on Duke's head where it had been when she'd fallen asleep for the final time. Duke knew immediately. He lifted his head, studied her still face for a long moment, then released a sound that was part whine, part howl. A vocalization of grief so profound that it woke both Becca and Tommy Ray from their vigil in the living room. They found Duke standing guard beside the bed, his posture rigid with protective purpose. He wouldn't allow anyone near Betty May's body initially, positioning himself between her and the world as if his presence could somehow reverse what had occurred. "It's okay, boy," Tommy Ray said softly, his own voice thick with unshed tears. "She's at peace now." But Duke wasn't ready to accept peace. For the next 6 hours, he maintained his vigil beside Betty May's body, refusing food, water, or comfort from either of the humans who tried to coax him away. When the funeral director arrived, Duke's low growl made it clear that strangers weren't welcome. The funeral arrangements became a nightmare of logistics complicated by Duke's fierce devotion. He refused to leave the funeral home during Betty May's preparation, camping outside the building despite the December cold. When well-meaning friends tried to take him home, he'd return within hours, somehow finding his way back to the last place he'd seen his beloved human. "He's going to make himself sick," Becca worried, watching Duke through the funeral home's window. The German Shepherd had lost weight visibly in just 3 days, his thick coat unable to hide his diminishing frame. Tommy Ray's military experience with grieving soldiers gave him insight the others lacked. He's saying goodbye in his own way. We can't rush this process. The funeral service at First Baptist Church became a testament to Betty May's impact on the community, but Duke's presence transformed it into something extraordinary. Pastor Williams had initially worried about allowing a dog in the sanctuary, but Duke's behavior was beyond reproach. He walked slowly down the aisle behind the casket, his head low but his bearing dignified, then positioned himself at the front of the church where he remained motionless throughout the entire service. When Becca rose to deliver the eulogy, her voice cracked as she spoke about the woman who'd saved her life twice, first from the fire, then from a childhood of institutional care. Betty May Thompson taught me that family isn't about blood relations. It's about showing up every day with love that doesn't require reasons or conditions. Tommy Ray's brief remarks focused on Michael and the connection that had brought them all together. Mrs. Thompson honored her son by completing his mission. She made sure his war buddies weren't forgotten, that his sacrifice had lasting meaning. Duke here is proof that some bonds transcend death itself. But it was Duke's behavior at the graveside that broke everyone's composure. As the casket was lowered into the frozen ground, the German Shepherd approached the grave's edge and dropped his favorite tennis ball into the earth. A final gift to the woman who'd given him purpose and love. The sound that emerged from Duke then was unlike anything the mourners had ever heard from an animal. It was a keen of loss, so human in its anguish that several people openly wept. Mrs. Henderson later described it as the sound of a heart breaking in real time. After the funeral, Duke's grief took a troubling turn. He refused to return to Betty May's house, instead camping at the cemetery in the exact spot where they'd lowered her casket. The December weather turned brutal, with temperatures dropping below freezing and wind that cut through the thickest coat. Tommy Ray tried everything, bringing Duke's food to the cemetery, setting up a makeshift shelter, even sleeping outside himself in solidarity. Nothing worked. Duke had essentially gone on a hunger strike, his bright eyes growing dull with each passing day. He's giving up, Dr. Martinez from the veterinary clinic told Tommy Ray after examining Duke at the cemetery. Sometimes animals bond so completely with their humans that they can't survive the separation. We call it broken heart syndrome. Becca was beside herself with guilt and worry. This is my fault. I should have insisted on taking him to Nashville. Allergies be damned. He needed continuity, not another upheaval. This ain't about you or me, Tommy Ray replied, his voice rough with his own grief. Duke's processing loss the only way he knows how. Sometimes the deepest love requires the deepest mourning. By December 23rd, Duke had been at the cemetery for 4 days. His weight loss was becoming dangerous, and his responses to human interaction had diminished to almost nothing. The veterinarian was beginning to discuss end-of-life options if Duke didn't start eating soon. It was then that Tommy Ray remembered something Betty May had said during one of their porch conversations. Duke's always been good at reading hearts. Sometimes he knows what people need before they do. That night, instead of trying to coax Duke away from the grave, Tommy Ray brought a sleeping bag and camped beside him. In the bitter cold, surrounded by snow and silence, the 2 war veterans, one human, one canine, shared their grief without words. I know how you feel, boy, Tommy Ray whispered into the darkness. I lost my best friend, too. Michael saved my life, and now I don't know what to do with the life he gave me. Duke's ear twitched, the first sign of awareness he'd shown in days. But maybe that's the point, Tommy Ray continued. Maybe the way we honor them isn't by dying with them. Maybe it's by living for them. Around 3 a.m., the same time Betty May had passed, Duke finally moved. He stood slowly, approached Tommy Ray's sleeping bag and settled beside the human with a sigh that seemed to release 4 days of accumulated sorrow. When dawn broke on Christmas Eve, cemetery workers found them both asleep against Betty May's headstone, Duke's head resting on Tommy Ray's chest, their breathing synchronized in the rhythm of shared survival. "Time to go home, boy," Tommy Ray murmured, waking to find Duke watching him with eyes that held recognition again. "We've got work to do." Duke stood, walked to Betty May's grave one final time, and placed his paw on the fresh earth. The gesture felt like a salute, a promise, and a goodbye all at once. Then he turned away from the grave and walked toward Tommy Ray's truck, his tail giving a single determined wag. The spell of grief wasn't broken. It was transformed. Duke's love for Betty May would never end, but it had found a new expression, carrying forward her mission of healing and service. As they drove through Millfield's snow-covered streets, Duke sat in the passenger seat with alert posture, watching the familiar landmarks scroll past. When they pulled into Tommy Ray's driveway, he exited the truck with purpose and walked directly to the front porch, where he sat and looked expectantly at his new handler. The message was clear. Duke was ready to begin the next chapter of his story. The boy who'd mourned so deeply had proven he could love just as deeply, and that love would fuel whatever came next. But even as hope began to return, neither Duke nor Tommy Ray could anticipate the crisis that would test their new partnership within days of its formation. The government bureaucracy that had threatened Tommy Ray's benefits was about to deliver a blow that would challenge everything Betty May had worked to establish. The real test of Duke's mission was just beginning. The letter arrived on December 28th, its official government seal a harbinger of the crisis that would shatter the fragile peace Tommy Ray and Duke had begun to build. Duke was in the backyard, slowly rediscovering his appetite while Tommy Ray worked on repairs to the porch railing, both of them settling into the rhythm of shared healing, when the postal truck delivered what would prove to be a devastating blow. The Veterans Administration had completed their reassessment of Tommy Ray's mental health status. Based on observed improvements in social functioning and reduced isolation behaviors, his disability rating was being reduced from 100% to 30% effective immediately. His monthly benefits would drop from $3,200 to $467, barely enough to cover utilities, let alone mortgage payments, food, and Duke's care. Tommy Ray read the letter 3 times before its implications fully registered. His hands began to shake, not from his usual PTSD tremors, but from pure panic. Duke appeared at his side instantly, pressing against his legs with the therapeutic pressure that had become second nature. "It's okay, boy," Tommy Ray whispered, though his voice betrayed the lie. "We'll figure something out." But the mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Betty May's house carried a monthly mortgage payment of $890, property taxes of $200 monthly, utilities averaging $150, and basic groceries for a man and a large dog running another $300. Duke's veterinary care, therapy, certification maintenance, and specialized equipment added another $200. The monthly expenses totaled nearly $1,800, almost 4 times Tommy Ray's new benefit amount. Duke's therapy dog income provided some help, but the VA center could only guarantee 15 hours weekly at $25 per hour, generating roughly $1,500 monthly. Even combined with his reduced benefits, they'd fall short by hundreds of dollars each month, with no margin for emergencies or unexpected expenses. The cruelest irony wasn't lost on Tommy Ray. The very improvements that made him capable of caring for Duke were being used to justify reducing the support that made Duke's care possible. When Becca arrived for her weekly visit that Saturday, She found Tommy Ray at his kitchen table, surrounded by financial documents, his calculator displaying increasingly desperate scenarios. Duke lay beside his chair, responding to stress signals the human wasn't even aware he was broadcasting. "The house will go into foreclosure within 3 months," Tommy Ray explained after walking Becca through the numbers. "I can probably cover February and March if I drain my savings, but after that—" He gestured helplessly at the paperwork. Becca's medical mind immediately began calculating solutions. "I could help with the mortgage payments. My practice is doing well, and Mama left me enough to—" "No." Tommy Ray's refusal was immediate and firm. "I won't be a charity case, especially not from someone who already questioned whether I deserved this chance." The reference to their earlier conflict stung because it was accurate. Becca had opposed Betty May's decision to leave the house to Tommy Ray, and they both knew it. "That's not what this is about," Becca protested. "This is about honoring Mama's wishes. She wanted Duke to have a stable home, and he'll have one, just not here." Tommy Ray's plan was devastatingly practical. He would sell the house, use the proceeds to rent a small apartment, and continue Duke's therapy work on a smaller scale. The money from the sale would provide a financial cushion for several years, even with reduced benefits. Duke seemed to sense the gravity of the conversation. He moved to the window overlooking Betty May's garden, where her favorite rose bushes lay dormant under snow. His posture conveyed a melancholy that both humans felt but couldn't fully express. "You can't sell this house," Becca said finally. "It's been in Mama's family for 40 years. It's where she raised Michael, where she raised me. It's where Duke learned to be a therapy dog." "Sentiment doesn't pay mortgages," Tommy Ray replied, though his voice carried its own note of loss. The argument that followed was heated and painful, complicated by grief, guilt, and the practical realities of post-war economics. Becca accused Tommy Ray of giving up too easily. He accused her of not understanding the burden of constant financial stress on someone with PTSD. Duke's response to their conflict was remarkable. Instead of becoming agitated or choosing sides, he began demonstrating the very behaviors that had made him such an effective therapy animal. He moved between the arguing humans, providing calming pressure to each in turn, his presence gradually reducing the temperature of their dispute. "Look at him," Becca said finally, her voice softening as she watched Duke work. "He's doing exactly what Mama trained him to do. How can we let him lose his home?" Tommy Ray's shoulders sagged with defeat. "Because sometimes love means letting go, even when it breaks your heart." That evening, alone with Duke in Betty May's living room, Tommy Ray made a phone call to a real estate agent. The conversation was brief and professional. The house would go on the market after the new year, with hopes of a quick sale in the current market. Duke listened to every word, his intelligent eyes tracking Tommy Ray's movements with unusual intensity. When the call ended, the German Shepherd did something he'd never done before. He walked to Betty May's bedroom, retrieved one of her slippers from the closet, and brought it to Tommy Ray. The gesture was so clearly communicative that Tommy Ray felt his chest tighten with emotion. Duke was reminding him of Betty May's presence, her wishes, her belief in their partnership. "I know, boy. I know she wouldn't want this either." "But what choice do we have?" The answer came from an unexpected source. 2 days later, Mrs. Henderson from the church appeared at Tommy Ray's door with a manila envelope and a determination that brooked no argument. "Betty May made me promise to give you this if circumstances required it," she announced, inviting herself into the living room, where Duke greeted her with unusual enthusiasm. The envelope contained documents that Tommy Ray read with growing amazement. Betty May had secretly established a trust fund using the life insurance money from Michael's death, money she'd never touched in 15 years. The fund was specifically designated for Duke's care and housing, with Tommy Ray named as both beneficiary and trustee. "She knew this might happen," Mrs. Henderson explained. Betty May understood government bureaucracy better than most folks. She planned for the possibility that your benefits might be reduced. The trust contained $127,000, enough to pay off the house mortgage completely and provide a substantial cushion for ongoing expenses. There was one condition. The money could only be used for Duke's care and maintaining his home base for therapy work. Tommy Ray stared at the documents in disbelief. "Why didn't she tell me about this?" "Because you wouldn't have accepted it," Mrs. Henderson replied with Betty May's characteristic bluntness. "She said you needed to choose Duke for the right reasons, not because it was financially easy." Duke seemed to understand that the crisis had passed. His tail wagged for the first time since Betty May's death, and he performed a play bow that both humans recognized as pure joy. The revelation reframed everything that had happened. Betty May's death hadn't been the end of her care for Duke. It had been the activation of a deeper level of protection she'd planned for years. The trust ensured that Duke's mission could continue regardless of government policy changes or economic uncertainties. But the document contained one more surprise, a sealed letter addressed to Tommy Ray to be opened only if the trust funds were activated. With shaking hands, Tommy Ray broke the seal and read Betty May's final words to him. "Tommy Ray, if you're reading this, it means the government tried to punish you for getting better. Don't let the bureaucrats win. Michael died believing that good men taking care of each other was the only thing that made war worthwhile. You and Duke are proof he was right. The money is Michael's legacy, and you're both his living memorial. Make him proud." The letter was signed with a simple, "Love, Mrs. Thompson," and a paw print that Duke had obviously contributed during the letter's creation. As Tommy Ray finished reading, Duke approached and placed his head on his new partner's lap, not in comfort for stress, but in celebration of victory. Betty May had outmaneuvered death itself to ensure her mission's success. The boy who had waited so faithfully by the hospital window had been waiting for more than a final goodbye. He'd been waiting for the moment when his true purpose could begin, fully supported and completely secure. 6 months after Betty May's death, Duke and Tommy Ray had transformed not only their own lives but the entire landscape of veteran care in Millfield and the surrounding counties. The trust fund revelation had been just the beginning of a journey that would prove Betty May's wisdom in ways none of them could have anticipated. The mortgage-free house became the foundation for something unprecedented. Michael's Heroes, a comprehensive therapy program that paired rescued dogs with veterans suffering from PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and the invisible wounds of war. Duke served as both the program's flagship therapy animal and its chief trainer, teaching other dogs the subtle art of reading human emotional needs. Tommy Ray's transformation was remarkable to witness. The broken, isolated man who'd hidden behind empty bottles had evolved into a confident program director whose military bearing now served a healing mission. His first-hand experience with trauma, combined with Duke's intuitive therapeutic abilities, created an approach that traditional VA programs couldn't replicate. "Duke doesn't just provide comfort," Tommy Ray explained to a reporter documenting the program's success. "He provides hope. When a veteran sees this dog choosing to help, choosing to stay, choosing to care, it changes something fundamental about how they see themselves." The program's success attracted attention from across the region. Veterans drove hours to participate in weekend sessions where Duke would demonstrate therapeutic techniques to other dogs while their human partners learned handling skills from Tommy Ray. The house that might have been lost to foreclosure became a pilgrimage site for healing. Becca had become an unexpected ally in the program's expansion. Her veterinary expertise proved invaluable in screening and preparing rescue dogs for therapy work, while her initial skepticism about Tommy Ray transformed into genuine respect and affection. She'd established a satellite clinic in Millfield, working 2 days weekly to support the program's medical needs. Mama knew exactly what she was doing, Becca admitted during one of her regular visits. She wasn't just saving Duke, she was creating a legacy that would save hundreds of people. The relationship between Becca and Tommy Ray had evolved from suspicious tolerance to something approaching family. They'd never discussed it explicitly, but both understood that Betty May had orchestrated their partnership as carefully as she'd planned Duke's future. Their shared commitment to honoring her memory had bridged their differences in background and perspective. Duke's celebrity status in the veteran community brought unexpected challenges along with recognition. Requests for his services far exceeded what one dog could provide, even with his remarkable stamina and dedication. The solution came from Duke himself, who began demonstrating an unprecedented ability to train other therapy dogs. "It's like he's teaching them his language," observed Dr. Sandra Mills, a psychiatrist who worked with the VA program. "Duke shows the new dogs how to recognize specific trauma responses, how to provide appropriate pressure therapy, how to interrupt nightmares and flashbacks. I've never seen anything like it." The training sessions took place in Betty May's backyard, where Duke would work with rescue dogs of various breeds and temperaments. His teaching methods were patient but firm, demonstrating proper therapeutic positioning and response timing with the precision of a master craftsman passing down sacred knowledge. One particularly moving session involved a young German shepherd named Scout, who'd been rescued from an abusive situation and was too fearful to interact with humans. Duke worked with Scout for weeks, gradually building trust through parallel walks, shared meals, and patient modeling of therapeutic behaviors. Scout's breakthrough came when he saw Duke comforting a veteran having a panic attack, Tommy Ray recounted. Something clicked, and Scout just started mimicking Duke's movements. Within a month, Scout was placing in homes with veterans who needed exactly his type of quiet, steady presence. The success stories accumulated like stars in a constellation of healing. Marcus Wheeler, a Marine who'd lost both legs in Afghanistan, found purpose again through his partnership with Luna, a border collie mix Duke had trained. Sarah Patterson, one of the few female veterans in the program, credited her dog Rex with saving her from suicide, calling him the only one who understood that coming home was harder than going to war. But perhaps the most profound transformation occurred in Tommy Ray himself. The man who'd spent years drowning his survivor's guilt in alcohol had found a way to honor his fallen friend that gave meaning to his continued existence. Michael always said the point of surviving wasn't just to live. It was to make sure the guys who didn't make it weren't forgotten. Tommy Ray shared during a program graduation ceremony. "Every dog Duke trains, every veteran who finds hope again. That's Michael's voice, saying his sacrifice mattered." The program's success attracted national attention, including a feature story in Military Times and interest from the Department of Veterans Affairs in replicating the model nationwide. Duke appeared on the cover of the magazine, sitting at attention beside Tommy Ray, both wearing their service credentials with obvious pride. The media attention brought unexpected reconnections. Fellow soldiers from Tommy Ray's unit reached out, many struggling with their own post-war adjustments. The house became a regular stopping point for veterans traveling through Tennessee, with Duke greeting each newcomer as if he'd been waiting specifically for their arrival. One particularly emotional reunion occurred when Sergeant First Class David Rodriguez, who'd served with both Michael and Tommy Ray, arrived unannounced on a Sunday afternoon. Rodriguez had been battling severe PTSD and had driven 15 hours from Texas after reading about the program online. Duke's response to Rodriguez was immediate and intense. The dog approached the veteran with careful deliberation, then performed a specific sequence of behaviors that clearly communicated recognition and welcome. Rodriguez broke down in tears, explaining that Duke's actions were identical to those of a military working dog named Rex who'd served with their unit in Afghanistan. "It's like Duke remembers," Rodriguez whispered, kneeling to embrace the German shepherd. "Like he's carrying something from over there to here." The reunion led to Rodriguez becoming a regular participant in the program, eventually relocating to Tennessee to serve as Tommy Ray's assistant director. His military experience and Duke's endorsement gave the program additional credibility with skeptical veterans who might otherwise resist therapeutic intervention. As the program's first anniversary approached, Tommy Ray found himself reflecting on the incredible journey that had begun with Betty May's diagnosis. The dying woman's vision had evolved into something far beyond what any of them had imagined, a sustainable, replicable model for veteran care that honored both human and canine service. Duke had matured into a role that perfectly balanced his individual therapeutic work with his responsibilities as a trainer and program ambassador. His intelligence and emotional intuition had made him irreplaceable, but his teaching abilities ensured that his impact would continue exponentially through the dogs he trained and the lives they touched. The house itself had become a symbol of hope in the veteran community. Betty May's roses, carefully tended by Tommy Ray and Duke, bloomed each spring as a reminder of renewal and resurrection. Veterans often spent quiet moments in the garden, finding peace among the flowers that had brought Betty May such joy. "Sometimes I talk to her out there," Tommy Ray admitted to Becca during one of their planning meetings. "Tell her about the new dogs, the veterans who found their way back." "I swear Duke listens like he's translating for her." Becca smiled, watching Duke through the window as he supervised a training session with 2 new rescue dogs. "Maybe he is. Mama always said love doesn't end with death. It just changes form." The program's success had exceeded every expectation, but its greatest triumph was the simple fact of its existence. In a small Tennessee town, a dying woman's love for a German shepherd had created a legacy of healing that would continue long after all of them were gone. Duke's mission had evolved from comforting one grieving woman to healing an entire community of wounded warriors. Betty May's promise had been kept in ways that transcended her wildest dreams, proving that some bonds between humans and animals are indeed eternal. The boy who'd waited so faithfully by the hospital window had found his true calling, and in doing so had helped dozens of other souls find their way home from war. 1 year later, the anniversary of Betty May's death arrived with spring's first warm breeze and the scent of blooming roses in her garden. Tommy Ray stood at her graveside, no longer the broken man who'd once sat here in despair, but someone transformed by purpose and love. Duke waited beside him, his therapy vest identifying him as a working dog, though today he was simply a son visiting his mother's resting place. "Mission accomplished, Mrs. Thompson," Tommy Ray said quietly, placing fresh flowers on the headstone. "Your boy's doing good work." Duke approached the grave and performed the same gesture he'd made a year ago, placing his paw on the earth where Betty May lay. But this time, instead of grief, the gesture carried gratitude and promise. He'd kept his word to her in ways that exceeded every expectation. The walk back to the house revealed the full scope of what they'd built together. The modest home had been transformed into a beacon of hope, with tasteful signage identifying it as the Michael Thompson Memorial Center for Veterans and Therapy Dogs. The front yard featured a memorial garden where veterans could sit quietly among Betty May's roses, and the backyard had been expanded with training areas where Duke continued his work as teacher and healer. As they approached the house, the sound of laughter carried from the backyard, a weekly graduation ceremony where 5 new therapy dog teams were receiving their certifications. Duke's ears perked with recognition and pride as he heard the voices of veterans who'd found their way back to joy through the program he'd helped create. Tommy Ray paused at the front gate, studying the bronze plaque that had been installed just weeks after the program's first anniversary. It read, "In memory of Betty Mae Thompson, who knew that love doesn't end with death, it multiplies. In honor of Michael Thompson, whose sacrifice continues to save lives, in celebration of Duke, who taught us that some promises transcend death itself." The ceremony in the backyard was conducted with military precision but civilian warmth. 5 veterans stood with their newly certified therapy dogs, each pair representing months of careful training under Duke's supervision. Tommy Ray served as the officiating coordinator, but it was Duke who performed the actual graduation inspection, approaching each team to assess their readiness with the thoroughness of a seasoned commander. Marcus Wheeler, the Marine who'd lost both legs, stood proudly with Luna, the border collie mix who'd become his constant companion and mobility assistant. Sarah Patterson held the leash of Rex, the gentle giant who'd pulled her back from the edge of despair. 3 other veterans, a Navy corpsman, an Air Force mechanic, and an Army medic, stood with their own 4-legged partners, each dog bearing Duke's unmistakable training signature. "When I first met Duke," Marcus addressed the small crowd of family members and supporters, "I thought therapy dogs were just fancy pets. But Duke taught me something different. He showed me that healing isn't about forgetting what happened to us. It's about finding purpose in spite of it." Duke listened to the speech with the focused attention he gave all important communications. His head tilted slightly as if processing not just the words but their emotional weight. When Marcus finished speaking, Duke approached him and offered a gentle play bow, his signature gesture of approval and respect. Becca watched from the porch, her eyes bright with tears she didn't try to hide. Her transformation had been as dramatic as anyone's, from a skeptical daughter who'd questioned her mother's judgment to a passionate advocate for the program she now helped coordinate from her satellite clinic in town. "Mama would be so proud," she whispered to Mrs. Henderson, who'd become the program's unofficial grandmother and chief fundraiser through church networks across the state. "She knew this would happen," Mrs. Henderson replied with Betty Mae's characteristic certainty. That woman could see around corners when it came to matters of the heart. The graduation ceremony concluded with a ritual that had evolved naturally over the months. Each new therapy dog team would visit Betty Mae's rose garden for what they called the blessing. Duke would lead them through the garden paths, pausing at specific flowers as if sharing memories and wisdom that only he could convey. As the crowd dispersed and the veterans headed home with their new partners, Tommy Ray found himself alone with Duke in the quiet garden. The German shepherd had aged well over the past year, his coat still thick and lustrous, his eyes bright with intelligence and purpose. But there were subtle signs of maturity. A more measured gait, a tendency to rest between training sessions, a deeper thoughtfulness in his responses to new situations. "You getting tired, old boy?" Tommy Ray asked, settling onto the bench he'd built beside Betty Mae's favorite rose bush. Duke's response was immediate and clear, a vigorous tail wag followed by a playful pounce toward a tennis ball hidden among the flowers. His message was unmistakable. Retirement was not in his vocabulary. The evening brought its usual rhythm of quiet tasks and companionable silence. Tommy Ray worked on administrative duties for the program while Duke settled on his favorite rug, close enough to monitor the human's stress levels, but relaxed enough to indicate all was well. The house had become a sanctuary where healing happened in increments. Phone calls from veterans checking in, applications from new candidates, updates from teams placed across the region. A knock at the door interrupted their routine, unusual for the late hour. Tommy Ray opened it to find a young woman in military fatigues, her expression carrying the particular exhaustion of someone fresh from deployment. "Sir, I'm Specialist Jennifer Martinez," she said, her voice carefully controlled. I heard about your program from Sergeant Rodriguez. I was wondering, I know it's late, but Duke appeared beside Tommy Ray before the introduction was complete, his assessment of the newcomer swift and comprehensive. Within seconds, he'd moved to Jennifer's side, offering the gentle pressure therapy that had become his signature intervention. "Come in, specialist," Tommy Ray said, recognizing the signs he'd learned to read in countless other veterans. "Duke's already decided you belong here." The conversation that followed was achingly familiar, yet uniquely personal. Jennifer had returned from her third deployment to Afghanistan 3 months earlier, struggling with hypervigilance, insomnia, and the crushing weight of survivor's guilt after losing half her unit to an IED attack. The VA had provided medication and counseling, but nothing had touched the core of her isolation until she'd heard about a German shepherd who understood what it meant to carry impossible burdens. Duke's response to Jennifer was remarkable even by his exceptional standards. He seemed to recognize something specific in her trauma, positioning himself to provide exactly the type of support she needed, close enough to offer comfort, but careful not to trigger her startled responses. His intuition guided him to therapeutic interventions that Tommy Ray had never seen him use before, as if each veteran's pain required a slightly different key to unlock healing. "How does he know?" Jennifer asked through tears as Duke guided her through a grounding exercise she'd learned in therapy but never been able to implement successfully on her own. "I think Duke carries something forward from everyone he's helped," Tommy Ray replied, watching the familiar miracle of connection unfold. "Your healing becomes part of his wisdom, and he uses that to help the next person who needs him." As the weeks passed, Jennifer's integration into the program followed the pattern Tommy Ray had observed in dozens of other veterans. Initial skepticism gave way to cautious hope, which gradually transformed into genuine partnership and purpose. Duke worked with her daily, teaching patience and trust while she learned to channel her military skills into therapeutic applications. The turning point came when Jennifer was paired with Ranger, a young German shepherd rescue who'd been too energetic for traditional therapy work. Under Duke's supervision, Jennifer discovered that Ranger's high energy was perfectly suited for veterans dealing with severe anxiety. His exuberant affection and playful demands provided exactly the kind of positive distraction that could interrupt destructive thought patterns. "Duke's teaching me to teach Ranger," Jennifer observed during one of their training sessions. "It's like he's passing down everything he knows through us." The program's expansion continued beyond Tommy Ray's most optimistic projections. Requests for trained therapy teams came from veterans organizations across the Southeast, while inquiries about replicating the program arrived from as far away as California and Maine. Duke's reputation had spread through veteran networks with the efficiency of military communications, carrying hope to communities that had never imagined such specific help was possible. But the true measure of success wasn't found in statistics or recognition. It was visible in the transformed lives of individuals like Jennifer, Marcus, Sarah, and dozens of others who'd found their way back to purpose through the unlikely partnership of a dying woman's love and a German shepherd's dedication to service. On quiet evenings, when the training was finished and the paperwork completed, Tommy Ray would often find Duke in Betty May's garden, sitting among the roses with the patient stillness of someone keeping vigil. The dog seemed to understand that his mission extended beyond the veterans he helped directly. He was maintaining something precious that Betty May had entrusted to his care. "She's still here, isn't she?" Tommy Ray asked during one of these garden moments, settling beside Duke on the grass where they'd once sat with Betty May during her final weeks. Duke's response was a gentle nuzzle, followed by a contented sigh, his body language conveying peace and certainty. The message was clear. Love doesn't end with death. It transforms into something larger, something that continues to heal and inspire long after the original source is gone. The program that had begun with one dying woman's promise to one loyal dog had become a living testament to the power of unconditional love, proving that some bonds are indeed eternal. Duke had kept his promise to Betty May in ways that exceeded every expectation, creating a legacy that would continue healing broken hearts for generations to come. As spring turned toward summer and the roses bloomed with unusual abundance, the small Tennessee town of Millfield had become known throughout the veteran community as a place where miracles happened daily, where broken soldiers found wholeness through the wisdom of a German shepherd who'd learned from the best teacher of all, a woman who knew that the greatest act of love is preparing someone to live without you. Dear friends, this story reminds us that the deepest connections in our lives, whether with family, friends, or our beloved pets, create ripples of healing that extend far beyond what we can imagine. Betty May's love for Duke didn't end with her death. It multiplied into a legacy that saved countless lives. How many of us have experienced that transformative moment when an animal showed us unconditional love during our darkest hour? Have you ever witnessed the healing power that comes from the simple act of one soul refusing to give up on another? Please share your own stories of unexpected angels, whether they had 2 legs or 4, who changed your life when you needed it most. Your experiences could be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.